maybe 10, 15 minutes to look at that, especially if you have questions that are going to be asked. Then I will pass back. No, can we do these? No, then I'll pass you the new exam, ask you for questions. Okay, and then we will pass back at the end the second exam that we have. Okay, so you can have that. So just remind you, on the first exam you had 3 questions. The second you had 1. And then this third one you're going to see you're going to have 2 questions. So you're going to have 50% of your grade the first exam, and then 50% on exams 2 and 3. So the third exam will be 2/6, that's 1/3, 1/6 for the second exam, and 3/6 for the first exam. Got it? All right, and then I'll go through this with you. You can ask your questions once I pass it out. Exactly. All right. Ready? And in this, again, these are questions on this exam. That's why I'm doing this, and as well as a summary of what we've done. In a number of ways, the experience of the Soviet Union and other East European countries parallels that of the United States capitalism. That's the point I want to get across. It's kind of an ironic, unexpected result, which is what occurred there, and let's focus on the Soviet Union, that which we'll talk about the most, but you can extend this to other so-called socialist countries around the world. What occurred there, in terms of the development of its economy, again, parallels what happened in the United States. Okay? Push that theme here. Let me give you an example. In the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, between 1918 and 21, we had war communism. Those 3 years. And as I tried to explain to you, using the concepts that were developed in the course, which you must use on this exam, I'm going to emphasize that again and again. It's written on the exam. You have to understand it. You have to use what we developed in the course to answer these questions. So, in terms of what we developed in the course, what they called, that's what the Soviets and everybody else called war communism, then and now, was the establishment of state capitalism. And what that means is that a small group of state officials, state bureaucrats, appropriated the surpluses produced by workers in industry. Not agriculture, that was something else, that was the agents. But in industry, they established not communism. I understand it was called that, but state capitalism. In 1928, between 28 and 1921 and 28, during that period of time, so after war communism through the 1920s, throughout the 1920s, to use the language we developed in the course, what happened there was a reform of state capitalism. So they implemented a whole bunch of reforms that we discussed in the course. And they began to approach a kind of private capitalism. They never got there. It was still state capitalism, but it was reformed state capitalism. Reintroduction of markets, netmen, and so forth. Between 1929, the end of the 20s, and the 1950s, middle 50s, it was called by historians Stalinization. What that really was, as I explained to you, the robust growth of state capitalism. So state capitalism came back under Stalin and kind of took off. And we can success and failures of that state capitalism under this Soviet leader, Stalin. Then, because of the contradictions that were building up under the state capitalism, the tensions and so forth in society that I tried to explain to you, because of the terms of trade against the communist collectives, because of the pressing of the workers, raising their rate of exploitation, because of all of that, there were all kinds of new reforms that were introduced, starting with a guy by the name of Khrushchev, who followed the death of Stalin. And these were called post-Stalin reforms. Reforms of the economy, not to deal as much as they could with the crises that were simmering in the society. Then it all fell apart in the 1980s, and there was a movement then, which continues today, to private capitalism. Notice what's common: capitalism. Throughout the 20th century, what's common here is capitalism. Reforms of it, state capitalism, movements to private capitalism, but it's a continuation of capitalism. And what that means is not markets and profit. I gave you the critique of that. What that means is that the workers never receive the surpluses that they produce, and hence they never receive, they never distribute. That's communism. Only in the case of agriculture, under the collectivization, did that occur. It did occur, it was successful, and then Stalin turned around and made that successful experiment unsuccessful by squeezing it the way that he did, and that I explained. In the United States, between the after the Civil War, between the 1870s and 1929, that period of time, that was the tremendous growth of private capitalism. First tremendous growth of private capitalism occurred in Europe. Thereafter, it was in the New World. From the 1870s, roughly, to 1929, we had a growth of a kind of unfettered private capitalism, in which the state played a very limited role. Unfettered means those markets, that private property, there was very little, if any, controls over them. There were some, but not too much. This unfettered private capitalism collapsed in the Great Depression, not just here, but around the world. It just collapsed. It fell apart. That's your grandfather's, grandmother's history. Hopefully they're still alive. You can ask them about that. It collapsed. And that was really scary to everybody. And that ushered in, roughly between 1930 and 1980, roughly 50 years, half a century, that ushered in reformed capitalism. So that private capitalism was reformed in a variety of ways, perhaps the most important of which was that the state intervened. It was expected to intervene in society to save capitalism from itself. The ideology there, I don't mean this in a pejorative sense, in a positive sense, the theory there was that of Mr. Keynes. So this British guy, macroeconomics, that which you have studied in 104, that became the hegemonic theory of the day. The state should intervene to save capitalism from itself. And all kinds of reforms were passed, many of which we still live with. Social Security, progressive taxes, Social Security, public education. Remember how I started the course? Roughly between 1981, starting with President Reagan, and the president, or I should go 1981, 2008. Okay. During those couple of decades, 30 years' time, after the early 1980s, we moved from a regulated capitalism with all these reforms We move more to an unregulated capitalism. A kind of return to this unfettered capitalism between 1870 and 1929. In which we dismantled many of those regulations and those reforms that were passed, starting with FDR, Eisenhower, JFK, and all the other presidents. It's a dismantling in the United States under the first time of President Reagan, in England under Thatcher. It's a return to kind of unfettered markets. Then the whole thing collapses. In 2008, well, remember this, 2008, we have a new 1929. It looks as if capitalism is going to collapse. And so what happens? Starting with a conservative Republican president, don't forget. Starting with President Bush, the state intervenes to save capitalism from itself. Continuing with President Obama. And it works. And then starting today, and for the next several years in which you're going to be impacted, me too, there is a debate in the United States. And people are now arguing we should get rid of this government regulation and so forth, etc., and return to an unfettered capitalism, as it was between 1870 and 1929, and between 1981 and 2000. That's the debate today. Get the state out of the private sector. Notice the commonality here. Capitalism. Whether, there's two different kinds of capitalism. There's this unfettered private capitalism, and then there's this regulated private capitalism in the United States. And we oscillate between them. What are we oscillating between? A managed and an unmanaged capitalism. But it's still capitalism. What does that mean? A small group of individuals here in the private sector, unlike the Soviet Union, in the private sector, appropriate the profits, the surplus produced by the workers. Soviet Union, capitalism. A state-managed capitalism to a more private capitalism. It's still capitalism. In their case, for long periods of time, it was state bureaucrats that appropriated the surplus. Now they have private industrialists appropriating the surplus, produced in both cases by workers. So, in either case, whether it be the States or in the Soviet Union or Poland, Czechoslovakia, or Cuba, whatever the case may be, Vietnam, these reforms, which have been passed at various points in time, and they've been passed because of the contradictions of capitalism. It's the contradictions of capitalism that push the people in society to try to reform, markets, manage markets, create what do they call it, an umbrella so that people can be protected from the problems of the market. A social safety net, all that stuff. The reforms of capitalism are that, reforms. It's not a dismantling of capitalism. So, across the 20th century, this is your exam question, across the 20th century into the 21st, we had different forms of capitalism. I understand that it was called communism and socialism in Eastern Europe and other parts of Asia and Africa. So, I understand that. That's why I had to unteach it to you. But it was the century, now into the 21st, the century of a growing, robust economic structure called capitalism that continued when it was launched in the 1750s. The last 300 years, 350 years, we've had capitalism of different forms. What we have not had is this communism or socialism on a massive societal basis, despite people's claim. It conflated reform with communism. So what failed in the USSR was a kind of capitalism. That's what fails. State capitalism. And from this perspective, what fails, depends on your politics in the United States, what fails in the United States is either a regulated or an unregulated capitalism, depending on your point of view. But communism, in the sense of extending fairness and justice and democracy, I'll pick up those words again, to the workers, to enable them to receive the surplus that they produce, that's still on the social agenda. That has not been accomplished. That's what Marx had in mind. That's what these Marxists thereafter had in mind. It's a loss across the 20th century into the 21st. That was the idea. It's a simple idea that the old man came up with, but that has never been accomplished on a societal basis. Okay, I'm not going to give you this exam. Okay, and read it, please. There are two questions. I prefer you to ask your questions here, like in the first two exams, so we can all share your questions and answers. Yeah, okay, man, it's no sense here having to climb over everything. Yeah. Okay, so take a copy and pass it back. Where are you going? I should have planned it. These are planning with interest. Okay, go on. You might pass back that way.
Yeah, that's the thesis of posterity. Yeah. It's a debated point. Like, some of the professors in the departments think it was socialism. It failed because of power relations or whatever. It's a lively debate, and or if you read like the sleazy Jeff Time debate, they don't even have a clue what to call it. Post-revolutionary society. Let's say capitalism, that's what Van Cosby called it. It makes sense in the way Resnick felt. What's the question?
Please read. Thomas, do you have one?
Yep.
Okay. Thomas, do you have this page? I did 125.
Yeah, we have about 9.
Shot on the first exam.
That's a really good question. I can.
It's strange. We made about 30 short. I printed off 120 or 110 on the first exam.
There's a black hole. Someone's taking extra copies. That looks like a pretty reasonable exam.
Okay. If I have time to read. Okay, questions? Anything administratively or in terms of content that you want to ask on this? Yes, sir. Loudly so they can hear you.
So, for the first one, so you're obviously saying that there was never communism or socialism. It was just different forms of capitalism, right? In practice in the world. Can we also kind of assess if there could be a communist government, assess whether it would fail or succeed given different options?
Let's take the first part. Okay? It says differences among forms should not be confused with things that you got. So you're going to answer that.
Yeah.
Your first words, I don't know what they mean in terms of the question. First thing you said, so I don't know.
Well, I mean, I was talking mostly about...
You said I mean, or you mean, or whatever.
I was mostly talking about question number 2.
Oh, I'm sorry. You asked me number 2.
Yeah.
Okay, part 1, number 2. Sorry, I thought you were doing that. Okay, so what's your question on that?
Okay, so obviously that the Soviet Union shouldn't be conflated with communism. Should we kind of talk about what if it were a communist society and whether it could have succeeded or would have had a chance?
I don't know. You've got to use the concepts of the course to answer the question.
Yeah, so can we do that?
Okay, quiet. It's a question. Be fair to him. Okay? And often it happens, somebody asks a question or answers it, and you don't listen, and I get the same question on email. So listen to what he's asking. Yeah.
Okay, so can we assess if it were true communism, whether we think it would have failed or succeeded? And
you've got to use the concepts of the course to answer whether or not to assess the validity of that statement that it failed.
Yeah.
That's what you got to do.
Okay. So
that's what you have to do. No way, I mean, that's what you have to do. So if you say to me that communism failed because the state in the Soviet Union was a dictatorship, we will fail you. Is that clear?
Yeah.
No, I'm not being mean to you personally, so this is for everybody. If you say to us that it failed because it was relatively inefficient, then you will get a lousy grade.
Okay, so my question...
Which will make your parents upset. Most important.
My question is, can we go beyond the question and say if it was
You
really...
can do whatever you want, but you got to answer the question that was asked.
Okay, but we can go beyond that.
Pardon?
But we can also go beyond the question.
But very careful. Now listen to this. You can go beyond the question. You can, this is in your hands. I believe in freedom. But I also believe in non-freedom. You must answer the question that I asked. After that, you can do whatever you want to do. But if you do not answer that question, you're not going to do well. Yeah.
Okay, for God's street.
I don't think I'm going to answer your question.
Cause is very simple answer. Cause and consequence of the communism.
Okay, you're talking.
For the question 3A, the cause and
3A.
Causes and consequences of the communist revolution. Is it okay if we use outside sources just to get better history?
Let me do that again, because that's another, it's similar to this question. Okay. Use absolutely. Okay. Your TA will love it when you draw in history, the 1905 war, the Russo-Japanese War. You bring all that stuff in, the assassination, the anarchism, all that. But you must use it within the context of what I've taught you. Right. But absolutely. Refer to that stuff. Absolutely. Let me do it again, because the two of you are asking one question here. You need to connect your additional statements about inefficiency or whatever history to the organizational surplus. That's the value added in this course. And if you can't do that, let me just add to this, okay? So you know, let's not fool around with each other, since many of you are juniors and seniors, and I'm a real old man. If you try to get this off the web, and you're going to spend $50 to $100 on this, you will fail. It won't work, because they do not know these concepts. So that's why this course is different than other courses. What they're going to give you is a traditional orthodox answer. And it ain't going to fly. So if you need the course to graduate, don't do that. Number one. Number two, don't copy from each other. We catch. If you catch, that's even more of a disaster. If you get caught, you will not graduate from this university or any other university in the United States. Don't do it. It's too risky. Don't do it. So 94% of you, 99% of you won't. But if you do it, by God, don't get caught. And if it's the first time you've been here all semester, c'est la vie. What else? You should, every single person that's been here, has gone through, the course, and that's about 2/3 of you, maybe even 3/4. You should have no trouble. It should be just all downhill for you. I don't mean tumbling down, I mean skiing. It should be real easy for you. We've answered these questions. We've got them reading. Okay? Many of you have asked really good questions in class, answered them. There should be no problem. And don't forget, these are, as I told you a long time ago, you're answering controversial questions in part 1. In part 2, they're very controversial for those people who are, who are working with social media. These are radical questions, and you're going to provide radical answers. Yeah. Are you twirling or are you no? Okay. I thought you had a question. Anything else? You sure? Yes. Sorry, sir.
Say we're answering one of these questions and we sort of run out of steam. Can we answer other ones also to fill it in?
No.
Don't do it.
You're going to answer. If you answer 3 questions, we're only going to grade the first 2. So, you waste your time. If you run out of steam, you'll be rewarded accordingly. No, just to, I think a couple of hours you're done. That's plenty of your typing. Okay, so look at your notes, do whatever reading you're going to do, put everything aside and type. Anything else? Oh, yeah, man.
Okay. What's the difference between socialism and communism?
I knew you that. You're consistent. The first thing all the way through. It's okay. It's okay. See, what's the difference between socialism and communism is a good question. Anyone of you want to take a crack at this? It's a good question. Yes, sir. But the scholars can hear you.
The difference between socialism
and communism. Yes.
Well, you have the equation that he's been giving us all year with the surplus value and you have the subsumed class processes. So on the left hand side you have the surplus value, which in capitalism, the capitalists take that surplus value and they can spread it up through their payments, and then they also get whatever profit.
Okay, but what's socialism in this?
What is socialism?
Yes, he asks, what's the difference between what you described, which is communism? Does the workers produce and the workers appropriate and distribute the surplus with that equation? SL or SV bracket COM bracket equals sigma SSCP bracket COM. COM stands for communism. He asks, what's the difference between that and socialism? Yeah.
Socialism is a transitionary period in capitalism where the state still exists.
Fine. Now, in terms of what we did in this course, so I really think what he's after. In terms of what we have done in this course, and what I just told you, what is socialism? In terms of, I understand what Engels called it, and what Kautsky, and Paul Sweezy, and Bettelheim, and Novak, and Stalin, and Trotsky.
Okay, so in each you would have the communist class process. But I think, I think you can take Engels in this, it depends on how those workers decide to distribute the surplus. In socialism, they would distribute it according to the work done. But
I understand that. That's not really what he's asking. What he's asking is from the perspective of this course.
Yeah.
He's not asking you about. See, the answer was first communism is when the workers produce and appropriate and distribute the surplus.
Yeah, so both have the communist class process, but in socialism they would distribute it on the basis of work, whereas in communism it would be on the basis of need.
So that's in the literature. From the perspective of this, let me answer the question. Okay, this is why it's such a good question. From the perspective of what we've done, from what we've done here, what these other characters, famous people call socialism, what Bettelheim and Engels and all these characters call socialism, is capitalism with a happy face. I'm actually famous for that expression. What they call socialism is capitalism with a happy face. It's all the reforms of capitalism. What you just described to me is a communist society in which they have two different distribution systems. And you may, if you want, that would be neat. There's something new and novel in terms of what you just did. You could say, okay, there's two different kinds of communism here. And I'm going to call the first one socialism. But that's different from really what Lenin did. That's a much more sophisticated answer than what Lenin did. What he did, what he confused with, he got confused. He called capitalism socialism because of all these reforms, the collectivization of ownership, the planning, distribution of goods on the basis of need, and blah, blah, blah. What he missed, this great thinker, what he missed was the most important contribution of the guy that he admired the most, Marx, which is who is producing and who is appropriating the surplus. As I told you, that was the old guy's great contribution. Whatever you think of it, that was what he thought. And he missed that. He thought it became a technical matter for him. So, the answer to your question, ever since 1917, when it was first launched, increasingly over time, socialism became a society in which you pass all kinds of reforms. But basically, from what I taught you, from the surplus labor perspective, it's capitalism. It's a nice capitalism. That's precisely what President Obama wants to deliver. It's a humane, nice capitalism. It's not socialist. Now, I understand he gets accused of being a socialist. I understand that. That's interesting and fascinating. But it's got nothing to do with what we just did in this course. That's the new education for you that you can carry when you get out of here. So you can counter those kind of arguments when you come, and you will come across them. What else? It's a good question. Yeah.
So from what you showed us before about the entry points,
Yes, sir.
So this version of socialism only exists within the narrow entry point of surplus labor.
I know it. It's very narrow. It's only there. So it could be accomplished like that. Snap anymore. I can't think of a more provocative message to leave you with. It doesn't seem like it would take much to establish in the United States a new fundamental class process in which workers both produce profits and appropriate them. That seems to be fair and just. Yes, sir. What else? Let me move the guy behind you. Yeah. Loudly, sir, so they can hear you.
How would you describe what's going on in China today?
Okay, but this is not really on your exam. Are you comfortable with your exam? Are you happy and pleased? Good. You have a question on the exam?
Not exactly, more a question about you.
Okay, let's take the China today, because it's not very good. Okay? There's a book that I would recommend that I put on the reading list. It's by Satya Gabriel, Gabriel. He teaches at Mount Holyoke, down the road. I didn't a former student here, actually. It's a movement from a kind of state capitalism to that of private, but still has state capitalism in these state enterprises, much more than it doesn't exist anymore in the Soviet Union. There, it's the establishment, in many of these enterprises are they kind of private capitalism in which the people on the boards of directors of these private enterprises, they appropriate and distribute the surplus. They have more of that in agriculture as well, although it still has a strong, ancient agriculture. But it's more of private capitalism there. So it's a movement from state to private, but they still have a lot of state capitalism. So if you ask, which I have, you ask some Chinese officials and so forth, you ask them the provocative question. A lot of surplus is produced in these enterprises. Who appropriates it? And they come back very quickly. Well, it's either state officials in the state enterprises, or it's private businessmen in the private enterprises. And I ask, why do you then call it communism? And there's no answer. So the silence is deafening. To quote a very famous philosopher. What do you think about that? Your question.
Do you have any preference for a set of subsumed class processes to sustain fundamental communist class
No, you played there. That's a good question, man. They're non-class processes. So you dealt within the class power, property,
Yeah, I'm
markets.
asking you personally, if you have any preference for a certain set that you think would be better.
You know, I'm very much affected by, I'm American, obviously, I'm very much affected by our history. So I've been trained as an economist, so I understand the appeal to people of private markets and private ownership. So and democracy. So, and they appeal to me too, because, I'm part of just like you, the history of this great country. So I'm affected by all that. And so, if people want to play with that, that's fine. As was just pointed out, my entry point is very small. It's the only one I would like to see accomplished in the United States. How it's accomplished, I think that's interesting, and we can argue about it, and so it's okay with me. I prefer democracy to despotism. If you push me on that, why? I don't know, because of my mother. Like all of us. I don't care about markets and planning. They don't care. If you push me up, you think that, markets might have more of one thing rather than another, okay, I'm willing to go with markets. Same thing with private ownership. I'm not a market person, I'm not an ownership person, I'm not a power person. I'm a class person.
But then if you go within democracy, would you prefer democracy just for the workers?
Listen carefully, okay? There's one discourse which is suppressed and it's not available in the United States. And you get it in 373. It's not available anyplace else. Everybody else does power, property, and markets. That's fine. That's what you get. I just give you one little thing, which is the organization of surplus. So if you can combine together those two things, what you get in those other places with what I give you, wunderbar. Fantastic. Ask that question of these other people. Ask them the class question. Ask them the question, hey, professor, are you interested in the organization of surplus? You're going to get silence. So the burden is on them. That's what you should ask as a student. What else? Good luck, you folks. Okay, for those of you who are graduating, fantastic.